Hey, War Party. How's it going? How's everybody doing? You guys doing good? Hope you guys are doing good today. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about why the 90s seemed to be the beginning of kind of not the greatest thing. The beginning of a not great time for America. For the United States specifically, but a little bit for Canada and a little bit for Mexico too. So, spoiler, it's NAFTA, North American Free to Trade, North American Free Trade Agreement. And collectively what I call NAFTA, but it was this push in general towards NAFTA-esque pseudo-globalistic policies that happened that made that a thing. So, I'll paint a picture for you. In the very, very early 90s, prior to 1994 and the implementation of NAFTA, people used to take boats out on lakes and sailboats and jet skis and all kind of stuff. And that kind of started to dry up. People couldn't afford the lake houses, couldn't afford the gas to take their sailboats into the lake. They didn't have the leisure time anymore to sail around. There's still some bass boats that happen, but the speedboating, just boating for fun, that was done. I'm not doing that anymore. A lot of companies, they went, overseas to Mexico. So, I think before we talk about globalism, before we talk about NAFTA, and how the decline of the U.S. economy kind of started in the 1990s, we need to look at what is globalism, what is NAFTA, and to understand those things, I think you have to understand what nationalism is. What is nationalism? Well, nationalism is what you'd think it would be. It's when you're for your team, when you're like, yay, go Sweden, or like you're like, go Japan, whatever your country is, yay, Canada, America's hat, yay, the prison colony that is Australia, it's so super cool. Whatever your country, whatever your nation was, whoever your people were, you were for that. And that was good. It's kind of how it's done. But people saw problems. Because you have these nations, and then these nations, they just keep fighting. And we had two big known world wars. And then, we had maybe a third world war that we might still be in. Cold War, fifth generation war, something like that. Who knows? Maybe we're in World War IV already. But anyway, so you have nationalism, but then you have internationalism. Internationalism, you have these different countries and they're all conducting business, sometimes on the high seas, and there's piracy, and there's these different, the Dutch have different opinions on international law than the Chinese, and the Chinese have a different opinion than the Japanese, and the Japanese have a different opinion than the British, and the British have a different opinion than the Americans, and everybody's got a different opinion. And well, like some of these things are, some of the concepts are bigger than nations, like religion. If you're a Christian, this you are more concerned with the kingdom of heaven than you are with maybe the United Kingdom. If you are in the kingdom of Arabia, kingdom of Saud, maybe you care more about Islam than you do about, your king. Of course, you're loyal to your king, your president, but the king or the president, your leader, prime minister, these people, they serve the citizenry and they serve God. So, and plus, for some people, they hold money sacred. And for them, whether they're industrialists or pharmaceutical companies or weapons dealers or they're, I don't know, banking cartels, they money is more important to them than country. If you're a Frenchman and, like things start going south and it looks like they're going to bring up the guillotines, maybe you got enough money and you got a passport or something. It's time to get out of Paris. And maybe you go live in French Algiers or somewhere else. And plus, we can't trust these nations to be fighting like, France and England. They had like 100 years war. Didn't they? Didn't they have like a? No, it was like a century-long war. That's crazy. Can we trust people to do this? Especially the technologies are getting. We've got nukes now. It can be delivered with intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the adults in the room. These very important people. And let's be honest. It's not as though these people were above nations, supranations, right? They think more than just petty national concerns. They think about international concerns. Maybe we don't need nations. Maybe we need 9 or maybe 7 different regions, and we can get everybody in these big, we can have one that'll be called the Euro, and it'll be everybody in Europe. We could get everybody in the Monroe Doctrine area. We can get those guys to be the Amero, and they can have their own currency, and be easier to control people. You can have this new world, collective understanding and law, a new world order, you might call it. And, so you have nationalism, which is highly problematic. But then we have internationalism, which is about peace, man. Peace. Peace in our time. So calm, it'll be peaceful. But, the problem is that some of these fraternal organizations and societies of secrets, some of these people have, they fomented wars between the nations and created world wars. We have the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, done by the Black Hand. Have you heard that name before? Black Hands and Black Sands. It's like these hidden kind of mafia types seem to be around at different. I don't mean the mafia like the Italian mafia, although potentially them as well. You have these groups that are, they're concerned with more than just their nation. Why would you want to control your nation when you could control the whole world? Right? So, some big plans being put forward. We're going to get rid of these nations. And we're going to have a problem, then we'll have a reaction to it, then we'll have a solution. And through this dialectic, we'll be able to, just have something more than the myopic view of just the nation states. And, Europe had theirs with the European Union. I can't really comment on that. I didn't live in Europe at that time, and so it's hard for me to comment, but I did live during NAFTA. And NAFTA is more than just that one set of laws, but it's the whole copious understanding of all of that type the restriction and reduction of any type of tariffs. Everything had to be free. The opening of borders, the creating of new infrastructures and highways, the talk about rail trains that we'll see if that ever happens because those funds have been misappropriated allegedly. Everything I'm saying is always allegedly. I'm just alleging. I'm alleging. Can we just allege here? But yeah, man, we had the NAFTA, and what I saw is people couldn't, textile mills would shut down, things would go to Mexico, the wages would be pushed down, because now you're not just competing with your Americans or people within your state, you're now competing with people in the third world. Mexico wasn't the first world, it wasn't, the US or the West, it wasn't Russia, and so everything else was third world, and that meant, it meant Mexico. Well, Mexico's not going to be third world anymore. We're going to bring them up. But we're going to do it at the cost of the American worker. And the American worker, so wages stagnated. We saw, you could just see it. You could just see the infrastructure started to crumble, the textiles, the auto manufacturing, electronics production. And then that kind of turned us into a service economy. And trucking kind of took off because now, things needed to be, before if you would buy a pear, that pear was maybe Northern California. Well, now that pear is made in Brazil. It's got to be trucked up the road. But it could be produced so much cheaper because, you could have essentially slave labor in Brazil. So free trade was always pushed as, this is the benefit, it's going to make it big. And it did make the cost of goods cheaper. You could get cheap Chinese crap, or you could get it from Mexico or somewhere. And the quality usually was not as good. I would argue that Mexican quality was better than Chinese, although I would argue that the stuff that was made in the USA was better than that. But yeah, so the quality went down, the price went down, and you could buy more junk. You could get more junk cheap off of slave or near slave labor. You just couldn't have land. You couldn't have land. You couldn't have a place to land your head. And they kind of, by this time, the last homesteading was kind of done in Alaska. I think they cut that off, 70s? I don't know, before I was born. So we're not giving away any more free land. That's not happening anymore. And we're going to dry up these little country towns because we're going to get everything made in Mexico that we can because these Americans want too much money. And their health care. It's getting, the insurance costs are getting too expensive. So if we just ship it overseas. And then the disruption, Again, now it doesn't even have to be. You could even move a job, like let's say from Mexico into Canada. But by doing that, it creates a disruption. And so the cost happens. In addition to the inflation, you have the stagnation of wages. You have the retraining cost because now Bob, your dad, he's working in Mexico, but he's either got to move to Canada where they got the job at now, or he can't do it anymore. Or the auto manufacturing that's done in Los Angeles is now going to be done in Mexico. And so we had Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles that lost their jobs to Mexican nationals in Mexico. And Americans, even things like Hollywood. You had with the laws being opened up and restriction on tariffs and why don't we just start filming stuff in Toronto? It's getting too expensive to film in Hollywood. You can't have that. So the ways I saw it is it hurt agriculture. For example, pears used to be grown and picked and they would be sent to Japan. This is prior to NAFTA. After NAFTA, those pear sheds, man, they shut up. because Brazil could produce it so much cheaper, so the Japanese could just buy their pears, from Brazil. And, everything, it's like a trickle down effect. Textiles in the Midwest, you had some places in like Missouri that used to make jeans in these little small towns and fabric for jeans, Wrangler or Levi, allegedly. And that would be sent to Mexico. So, and I think overall it was better for Mexico. We see currently, is China's just gotten way too expensive and problematic because they want a standard of living, kind of like we wanted a standard of living. And so now they're onshoring again, but when they say onshoring, it's not to our shores, not to the United States, it's to Mexico. I don't know how Canada's doing. If you're Canadian, speak in the comments. If you're making auto parts in Mexico and you like it and they're paying you a good wage, great. So it used to be in the past, if you were in Mexico and you wanted to make it, you'd have to come to the United States either legally or illegally. But now you can work in a factory in Mexico. I just don't know what the condition of those factories are. One of the other problems was the environmental impact of NAFTA. After the 90s, they make anticoagulants in Mexico that they use to get rid of pests. And the EPA would never allow for that kind of stuff here in the U.S. But you can have that stuff in Mexico. And so sometimes Mexicans, when they would come up to the U.S. to do guerrilla grows, would bring that stuff to, kill off the pests that eat the poppies or the cannabis. The problem is then the animals would eat it, and then it would have these downstream effects where it just starts killing off endangered owls and marmots and all kinds of stuff. Well, they're going to use the good pesticides that they have in Mexico. I mean, this stuff is strong. Well, the EPA says it's not legal, but they don't have an EPA in Mexico. So what does it matter? And then your average American doesn't even realize if his Ford Festiva or his Ford Focus or maybe his Maverick or allegedly, whatever the car might be, Bronco Sport, if it's made in Mexico, it says Ford. It doesn't say El Ford, though. It says El Ford. So, what does it matter? It's an American car, man. Made in America, Mexico. So, I will say this. The Mexican corn is so much better than American corn because American corn is all bioengineered crap. And they're pretty serious about their corn tortillas in Mexico. They have a good corn tortilla and they don't want American corn, which is poison allegedly. And I don't blame them because when I want my corn tortillas, I want my corn tortillas from Mexico. So, NAFTA. So, yeah, if you were in the United States in the 90s, NAFTA came in and started, it wasn't just NAFTA, it was all of the globalist stuff, because it wasn't just Mexico or Canada that got American jobs, it was also China. So, globalism as a whole. But we needed this new international post-World War II order. We can't just have everything be national. We need to have an international set of laws. We need free trade. We can't be having tariffs because tariffs could lead to war. And we just gotta have everybody on the same page, which is that the United States gets screwed and slave labor to the rest of the world will give them suicide nets, and when they start getting too uppity and they want a middle class, we'll get rid of their jobs too and we'll go to the next country. If that's Vietnam, fine. If in Mexico they get too happity-uppity, we'll go to Guatemala, or maybe we'll go to Panama, or Brazil, or wherever. But we're going to go somewhere where they don't get too uppity. They don't want too much environmental regulations, and we don't want... Let's be real. Some of those environmental regulations are highly problematic. They're the reason you can't get a K truck. because they're stupid. But then others are pretty good because they keep it to where you don't have poison in the air, poison in the water that you drink so that you don't get cancer and die. Do you want to live in Flint, Michigan? Because that's how you get water in Flint, Michigan. Do you want to have your rivers just full of externalities that are pumped out of the chemicals of factories? So, I don't know. Yeah, we got rid of our factory jobs to Mexico, but maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. Because maybe now they get all the pollution, and maybe they get to work the factory jobs that are terrible, standing on your feet in the concrete forever, and those terrible factory jobs that were largely being automated even, well, I don't know, in the 80s. They had welding robots and every other thing. But then again, you just have that same job in a factory, except for now it's at Amazon, allegedly, and you're still on that concrete floor with the robots. You just get paid less. And you can never have the American dream. I know, that's my thoughts. I feel like NAFTA really did us dirty. It was a trick. It was not good for Canadians. It wasn't good for Americans. The retraining costs when you lost your job and you had to do something new. The small country towns that maybe had like a textile deal, they're done. The stagnation of wages for 3 decades that happened because of it. Was it good for Mexico? I don't know. I know Mexico's doing much better in general, although that land's in chaos. If you live in Mexico and something I'm said is off base, let me know. I don't know. I don't live in Mexico, and it's been years since I've been there. So I know they have a burgeoning start of kind of their middle class because of the onshoring coming back from China, but it's not coming back to the U.S. And I think a lot of people saw that, hey, we don't want to produce, work in these factory jobs anymore. Okay, fine, but now you work on these service-related jobs. So everybody in America is now a servant. If I'm wrong, let me know in the comments. If not, think about subscribing.